Good day, folks, and welcome to the Anorak Review Show with your host, the Anorak. Looks like I'm talking about yet again another Pink Floyd album, quite soon after the last time, and much like the last episode's subject, this too had recently turned 40 years old. After the 1979 rock opera The Wall became such a big hit, one of many things that spawned from it was the 1982 film adaptation starring Bob Geldof and directed by the late great Alan Parker. And so, the initial idea for Pink Floyd's next album was to be a soundtrack of sorts to that film. Makes sense, since they had done soundtracks to movies before, so why not do one for their own movie? Originally under the fitting title of Spare Bricks, it would have included When the Tigers Broke Free and possibly some of the remixed versions of songs that were already from the original album but were adjusted for this film. Then, the Pink Floyd bassist and overall creator of The Wall, Roger Waters, also sought to expand on it and its narrative by utilizing songs and concepts that were originally written during sessions for that album and were even intended for it, but for one reason or another never made it to the final version. And then by April 1982, the Falkland Wars started happening. Yes, seriously, it was because of that conflict that Roger decided to somewhat change the direction for this new album. Rather than just being a soundtrack that's based around a film that's based around an album, it would indeed feature new material that better conveyed his feelings, and the stuff already planned for it would be rewritten slightly enough to reflect such as well. Though even back then, guitarist David Gilmour wasn't too sure about any of this idea to begin with, using outtakes from The Wall for a new studio album. Even back when it was intended to be a Wall movie soundtrack, apparently at one point David said to Roger, "If these songs weren't good enough for The Wall, why are they good enough now?" Unquote. I mean, I might get how he may have felt back then, but on another hand, someone could have easily rebutted by saying, if you've got to be crazy and raving and drooling, the respective early versions of Dogs and Sheep, weren't good enough for Wish You Were Here, why would they be good enough for Animals? But I digress. Nonetheless, they still went ahead with the album. However, while things seemed to be going straight forward, Roger and David even frequently playing Donkey Kong in spare time, there would be some definite tensions within the band. For starters, the late keyboardist Richard Wright wasn't involved in this at all, as he was fired by Roger Waters during production of The Wall for a few reasons, though he continued to play with them for the Wall tour as a salaried musician before leaving altogether once that gig was done with, making this the only album to not feature any contributions from Richard Wright. Even The Endless River, which was technically released years after his death, still has some of his archived recordings and keyboards and whatnot. Roger and David, though, didn't get along too well back then, as you might imagine, deciding to work separately, and the former even blaming the latter for not contributing enough to the overall record. And drummer Nick Mason actually seemed mostly chill as always back then. He was just having some marital issues and problems. But soon enough, despite all that, the album itself was eventually finished and released in March 1983. And honestly, there was no way it could have even been able to reach anywhere as big as The Wall had gotten. Despite having been made number one in the UK albums chart, it became the lowest selling Pink Floyd album worldwide since Meddle, and that was back in 1971. This could, and would be what culminated from many of the background stuff behind Animals and The Wall, and most of the stuff that would happen soon after. But for now though, let's jump into Pink Floyd's 1983 album, The Final Cut, and see if it still holds up just as well. We begin the record with the post-war dream. It starts off with a car radio being tuned into various different channels and stations. Again, very much like Wish You Were Here. However, these do seem to follow particular themes and ideas that would occur for a good chunk of the album. A fallout shelter being built in Peterborough, Cambridge, the replacement for the Atlantic Conveyor, an actual merchant navy ship that was indeed destroyed during the Falkland War, being built in Japan, even though, from what I researched, said replacement would actually be built in Tyneside, which isn't in Japan, so plans must have changed at the last minute then, I guess. And drugs being produced in third world countries like Bolivia. I also wish to point out that, like with The Wall, this too had a film of sorts to accompany it, albeit a short film as opposed to a full-length feature film. Said short film, titled The Final Cut Video EP, uses a few songs from the album itself more or less out of order, as well as this intro too, instead of just using the entire album and all its songs. It also features Alex McAvoy, who you may recognize as the school teacher from the Wall movie, playing presumably a World War II veteran as we see his perspective on this post-war world. While not said explicitly, it's implied that this veteran and the teacher from the Wall are in fact one and the same character, just that now we're seeing things from his point of view, his reflection on the world around him at that time. Although some of the songs here might also possibly about Pink himself, also reflecting on the world as well, soon after his wall was torn down, but I'll be getting to that soon enough. Back to the song itself, as those newscasters gradually fade out, we hear presumably a harmonium played by the late great Michael Carmen, a composer and an orchestral arranger and conductor who has not only done orchestrations for various other rock and pop music like Queen, Kate Bush, and Metallica, just to name a few, but has also done music scores for films such as Terry Gilliam's Brazil, Highlander, Die Hard, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, The Iron Giant, X-Men, again, just to name a few. Then we eventually get Roger Waters himself singing and asking why Jesus was crucified. Was it for this that Daddy died? Now already, this could very likely be from Pink's perspective, very soon after his trial had ended and his wall had been torn down. Once he finally wakes up to reality outside, figuratively and literally, he only now notices that what has been going on lately and wonders if things had truly even changed at all from his childhood years. That his father had to die in the Second World War for this? Did I watch too much TV? Is another line soon after that also may hint at this, especially if you've seen the Wall film, as Bob Geldof, as Pink, mostly sits and slouches while watching TV. At least the one that he didn't smash to bits. He also comments on the Japanese being so good at building ships, referring to them as a particular N-word that I doubt YouTube would let me say even with context. Let's just say it's considered an ethnic slur, kind of like another N-word. As well as their kids committing suicide. As long as a notorious internet celebrity doesn't film such on a camera, laugh about it, and then post it on YouTube. Then, as the orchestral music builds up, he soon asks Maggie, obviously referring to then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, what she had done, what they had done to England. What has become of England, if not the whole of Britain and the UK in general? Then we finally hear the drums of Nick Mason and the guitars of David Gilmour as Roger's voice, no longer quiet and hushed, but now loud and desperate. Should we shout? Should we scream? What happened to the post-war dream? A dream of peace and order between all nations on earth. I imagine Pink himself shouting out such questions, even if in his own mind, wondering what happened to that dream that his father died for, the death of which being the very first reason for the building of his wall to begin with in the first place. Crying out for Maggie, begging to know what we did, as the orchestra soon dies back down again, as if the answers to such questions haven't come yet or even at all. Pink Floyd has had some good, if not great, opening tracks from many of their albums. Astronomy Domine for Piper at the Gates of Dawn, One of These Days for Medal, Speak for Me for Dark Side of the Moon, Shine on You Crazy Diamond Part 1 for Wish You Were Here, Pigs on the Wing Part 1 for Animals, In the Flesh for The Wall, Signs of Life for A Momentary Lapse of Reason, and Cluster 1 for The Division Bell, and this is certainly no exception. Then, as we hear some creaking gates among other gritty industrial ambient sounds, we come to the next song, Your Possible Pasts. With that familiar sounding deep and twangy bass, we already get to hear something almost more like classic Pink Floyd, as Roger sings about how our possible pasts flutter behind us, our distorted memories of whatever truly happened back then, almost like the Mandela effect. Some bright-eyed and crazy, some frightened and lost. Others just don't care. In Derelict Sidings, the poppies entwine. Poppies, of course, will be a somewhat reoccurring bit of imagery across the album, not just in its artwork. Then we get to the dark, grimy rock chorus where Roger asks, "Do you remember me? How we used to be? Don't you think we should be closer?" Now again, anyone who has seen the Wall movie with keen eyes and ears may recognize this chorus in particular. In the brief sequence between the songs Waiting for the Worms and Stop and Before the Trial, when the character of Pink is in a public toilet, having broken down completely after his fanatical hallucination, he weakly and directly reads off this line from his little black book with his poems in. Now, the song was one of several tracks that were left on the cutting room during the Wall sessions before being revived for this album. So that could have been Roger's own sneaky way of putting in a bit of that lyric in. Who he could be directing those questions to is left open to interpretation, whether it be one of the politicians in power like Margaret Thatcher, or whether Pink's late mother, his late wife, the school teacher, some repressed part of himself even, or even what he imagines his father to be like since he never got a chance to see him. In the second verse, she stood in the doorway, the ghost of a smile haunting her face like a cheap hotel sign. And that hotel sign was only like £1.99. Though then again, with this economy and possible recession, even £1 would probably be seen as too expensive. And as her cold eyes implored the men in their Macs, one of them stood up boldly, put out his hand, and said, "I was just a child then, now I'm only a man." And as we all know, I am a man! Oh, nice. After the second chorus, we get another brilliant and very underrated guitar solo from David, similar to the one from Hey You. As we'll see, especially with solos like this, David has shown his contributions in driving home to raw emotion and feeling of many of the songs within his record with his guitar, even if it's still seen as extensively a de facto Roger Waters solo album. Another thing I wish to point out is that, with the absence of Richard Wright, the Hammond organ being played here is done by Andy Bound of Status Quo, who would also be part of the surrogate band during the Wall tour and would even play similar organ solos for Rogers' debut solo album, The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, which I could look at next year if given the chance. Anyway, in the third and last verse, we're taken in hand by the cold and religious, showed how to feel good and told to feel bad. Now that last bit pretty much sums up me when I try to watch 8 Crazy Nights. Tongue-tied and terrified, we learned how to pray, now our feelings run deep and cold as the clay. This could be about Pink reflecting back upon how he and other students would be taught and disciplined at school, comparing to how soldiers would be trained for war and combat both in World War II, the Cold War, and the Falkland Wars. How we'd have to suppress, bury, and control our emotions, all under the belief of some greater good. But now, strung out behind us are the banners and flags of our possible past, as they lie in tatters and rags, as if our nations and countries, along with their associated values that we have fought for, have all become undone and are falling apart. With its almost mellow verses and explosive choruses, your possible past is possibly a surpassing song. And just as the third and last chorus goes in and out, the monotonous sound of a ticking clock goes in, beginning the third song, One of the Few. Clocking up to about 1 minute and 11 seconds, this is pretty much the shortest track on the album, consisting mainly of an acoustic guitar played solely by Roger himself and the sound of someone's weak breathing. He sings about a war veteran, said to be a member of The Few, referring to an actual group of RAF pilots and Navy aviators who fought in the Battle of Britain and survived. As he asks, "What did you do to make ends meet?" Immediately following this, we could hear someone whispering, "Teach," implying that this would in fact indeed be the teacher from the war. Make them mad, make them sad, make them add 2 and 2. But what would happen if instead of getting 4, they'd get 5 as an answer? Makes you think, don't it? Make them me, make them you, make them do what you want them to. And I want them to eat their meat if they want to have their pudding. Make them laugh, make them cry, make them lay down and die. At least that's what Arthur Fleck did in the Joker movie. I myself would joke some more, but this is quite a very somber and bleak tone piece about someone still being haunted by what had happened in recently past conflicts, which in this kind of context may explain how and why the teacher turned out the way he seemed. This is his perspective and how he's dealing with it. It's honestly fascinating to see a different point of view in such music like this. Then we get to When the Tigers Broke Free, which is quite a unique case here, in that while this may have been intended to be part of the initial Wall movie soundtrack idea, this song wasn't on the Final Cut album when it first came out. It was only when the album was reissued on CD in 2004 would this song be officially included among the track list. And fittingly so in this gap here. The song itself was of course intended by Roger to be part of the original Wall album, but was rejected by the other members who felt it was too personal a song. And in a way, especially learning of Roger's own connection and childhood life, yeah, it actually does kind of personal. In a good way, that is. Consisting mostly, if not entirely, of Michael Kamen's conducted and marvelously arranged orchestra and choir, the lyrics in question seem to vaguely recap the Battle of Anzio, while offering Roger's own perspective when he learnt of his father's demise in said battle. The orchestral music builds up with its dramaticness as Roger sings with intensity and fragility about when the Tigers broke free and how no one survived from the Royal Fusiliers Z Company, how no one survived it. It honestly sounds and feels like epic trailer music for like a historical drama film, possibly about the effects and events of the Second World War, or any particular event of that time. Again, if June could use Eclipse as trailer music, anything goes. This song alone isn't just about the character of Floyd Pinkerton or even Syd Barrett, who was also a major model of influence on the aforementioned Pink character. This is about Roger himself and the premature loss of a father, especially to the cold, uncaring, and ruthless nature of war, much like in Us and Them. Soon afterwards, we hear some conventional rock instruments again with The Hero's Return. Much like with Your Possible Past, One of the Few, and When the Tigers Broke Free, this track was too originally written for The Wall, under the working title Teacher Teacher. Of course, it too never made it for the final release, but it would eventually be salvaged and rewritten for this new album. And as you might guess, imagine, and speculate, this song is too indeed about the schoolmaster, offering more of his perspective, as he questions what it's all about. Aside from David playing lead in rhythm guitars and Nick playing his usual percussion, Andy Bound returns once more with, this time, a Yamaha electric piano. One thing I really noted, especially adding on to the theory of this album being about said teacher as much as Pink, is one of the early lines here being trying to clout these little ingrates into shape. That very much reminds me of a somewhat similar line sung by the schoolmaster, or at least Pink's own conception of him, in the Wall song The Trial, being, "If they let me have my way, I could have flayed him into shape." This could actually be about the teacher reflecting back on how he treated all those kids back then. When he was their age, all the lights went out, and there was no time to whine and mope about. And indeed, there wouldn't be any time for that. They'd have to wait decades until the internet would be invented so they'd be able to waste our time complaining about minor trivial things. Another callback to The Wall is when, in a deep voice, Roger sings, "Though they never fathom it, behind my sarcasm, desperate memories lie." The sarcasm bit may be referencing Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, specifically the line, "No dark sarcasm in the classroom." Maybe he was being rough on the kids, just like he himself was being roughed up on during the war. A coping mechanism, perhaps? Who knows? Then in the middle section, the music turns more rather quiet, intimate and personal, as Roger asks if his sweetheart is fast asleep, feeling it's the only time he could really speak to her. Problem is, though, his wife is a pretty heavy sleeper, so whatever he says will just fly in one ear and then out the other. Assuming, of course, it's not blocked by the pillow. Actually, he confesses of something that he locked away, a memory that he considers too painful to withstand the light of day. This whole middle verse here may be yet another reference of continuity to The Wall, specifically the track The Happiest Days of Our Lives, in which Roger sings how certain teachers would go home at night only for their fat and psychopathic wives to thrash them within the inches of their lives. And only at a moment like this, when his wife is fast asleep, would the teacher be able to confess his true and honest thoughts and feelings. One memory he recalls is when he had just got back from the war, seeing the flags and banners on every door in sight, singing and dancing in the street, and hearing the church bells ring. But even back then, the burning in his heart and the memories of a gunner's dying words on intercom still soldier on. And as Roger sings about burning in my heart, we hear an acoustic guitar play a rather distinct and familiar leitmotif that we might recognize from certain tracks from The Wall, and would hear a bit more of later in this album. Regardless of whether it wasn't even intended to be such to begin with or not, this truly does feel like a legit sequel to The Wall, or at the very least expanding beyond the original narrative that centered around Pink and offers a different yet connective perspective. And fittingly enough, once the hero's return seemingly goes out with Roger mentioning the intercom, we hear just that. Someone speaking through, presumably, orders through an old intercom radio of sorts. The muffled quality and the exaggerated tone definitely gives it that old 40s, 50s, or 60s war movie vibe, like Battle of Britain, The Dam Busters, and A Matter of Life and Death. And that, of course, begins the next song, The Gunner's Dream. As the sounds of jet engines and wind gradually fade to the background. Don't Pink Floyd love using wind sound effects, by the way, especially to begin a song or two? We soon hear a lovely piano of sorts being played by either Michael Kamen or Andy Bound, or even both. And if the previous songs on this record weren't emotional enough for you, this will definitely do it for you. In this, Roger sings from the perspective of an air gunner as he's in a plane looking down from it. There's even a reference to the Rupert Brooke poem, The Soldier, as he sings, in the corner of some foreign field. And as he floats down through the clouds, in the space between the heavens, or the space between spaces, he had a dream of going to work while wearing nothing but knickers. Now, actually, the next few lines are kind of vague, but they do seem to imply that he's imagining his parents attending the service of his own funeral as he greets them goodbye and hears a tolling bell, even if they are oblivious to his presence. Then soon after, we get a sensational saxophone solo. Not by Dick Parry, however, but by none other than Raphael Ravenscroft, who I might have mentioned all the way back in my Robert Plant Pictures at 11 review, and he of course did the iconic solo for Jerry Rafferty's Baker Street. Yes, that very same one. And while this is more slow and downbeat compared to the more active and uplifting nature of Baker Street, it still has just as much energy and emotional gravitas. Then soon after that solo, Roger goes to describe in detail an ideal society in which people can live free without the fear of war, violence, and censorship. He even suddenly references the then recent bombings of Hyde Park and Regent's Park. You know, I actually went to Hyde Park a few years ago to see Roger Waters live, funny enough. It was a pretty good gig, plus an unexpected yet awesome rendition of Welcome to the Machine. It was very good. If anyone here watching this had actually been to Hyde Park back in 2018 to see Roger Waters live, feel free to comment. It would have been pretty cool. But even still, a dream is just a dream, as the gunner finds out far too late that the plane he's in had just been shot and is crashing down, resulting in utter oblivion. In the corner of some foreign field, the gunner sleeps tonight. And in the jungle, the mighty jungle, the lion sleeps tonight. Even though lions don't usually live in jungles, they actually live in savannas. What's done is done. But Roger also warns us not just to write off his final scene, but to also take heed of the dream, of his dream. The Gunner's Dream is a very bittersweet song, even by Pink Floyd standards, while offering a tiny little sense of hope by the very end. This is also one of 4 songs on this album to be featured in the video EP, and it honestly fits well, featuring, again, the war veteran / school teacher character by Alex McAvoy, and presumably his wife as well. There's not very much story behind it. He just kind of drives around in his car or kind of sits around late at night at home with his wife, kind of watching TV and stuff. But you still kind of get the idea of the feelings and kind of the thoughts and traumas they had just from Alex's own expressions. And this is the same guy who played a very scary looking school teacher just a year or two earlier. It's surprising how much sympathy you can get from this guy. Side 1 ends with Paranoid Eyes, as we hear some screaming footsteps on street pavement before the solemn piano plays again. This, along with Roger singing about buttoning one's own lip, gripping a bulletproof mask, and not letting the shield slip, seem to paint an atmospheric and almost even bleak picture of a weary man walking endlessly along a street late at night while trying to keep him to himself and not let any emotion or weakness be shown clear. A deconstruction on certain classic British values and phrases like stiff upper lip and keep calm and carry on. And if they try to break down your disguise with their questions, you can hide behind paranoid eyes. Sounds like most politicians during an interview. Putting on a brave face and fixing a grin, this character walks over the road for a jar, as in walking over to enter a pub. And cleverly, as we hear Roger sing about this, we actually hear some people chatter among a few other sounds in the background, as if we've actually found ourselves entering this old vintage pub as well with Roger. Honestly, a really interesting and artistic use of sound design in music. And to further cover up his true feelings and insecurities, this man laughs just a little bit too loud with the boys in the crowd at the rest of the world. Then in the middle of the track, Michael and the National Philharmonic Orchestra step aside as we hear not only Roger playing both bass and acoustic guitar, but also Andy playing in some organ. And surprisingly, the brief bit of drums here aren't played by Nick Mason, but instead by Ray Cooper, who also did percussion for several albums by Elton John, among other artists like Mick Jagger, Eric Clapton, Brian Ferry, former Beatles Paul, George and Ringo, and even on a solo album by Roger Waters and David Gilmour each. And as we listen to all this, we can also hear what may be a little game of pool or snooker, judging from those brief clanking sounds. The character the song is about may most likely be the school teacher / war veteran as we continue on his downward trend, especially if the brief bit in the video EP where he opens a beer bottle is anything to go by, even if the Paranoid Eye song isn't featured in said video EP. That all said though, this can just be as easily interpreted to be about Pink as well, lost and confused after the end of his war. And this can show how more similar the two are than either may realize. A cycle of abuse and how it may affect anyone. This character, be it the old teacher or Pink himself, believed in those old stories of fame, fortune, and glory. But now he's lost in a haze of alcohol and soft middle age. That pie in the sky, a common saying for something that seems pleasant and optimistic yet impossible to achieve, turned out to be miles too high. And so, we all hide behind paranoid, petrified, brown, and mild eyes. Even if your eyes may happen to be a different colour. Thematically, it does remind me a bit of Nobody Home from The Wall, in that they both seem like narrative streams of consciousness, describing a character's thoughts, actions, and surroundings as they go on by. It really does complement not only the themes of The Wall, but also its music and scale.